hospitals and also education institutes as well. There's been investment in the mining industry. Dubai Group owns 18% of City Gold, which is a major gold mining company in Australia. DP World has a shareholding in a number of Australian ports. And on the property side, again, the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority has invested in property opportunities in Australia. In financial services and private equity, this is an area that we're seeing increased interest, given the technology element to Australia and the innovative aspect to Australia, and the linkage back to acquiring that technology by investing in it in Australia. So there's 3 private equity investments there that are all technology related. And these are, I'd say, frontier investments. So there are a number of further opportunities in all of these sectors, particularly in the private equity side. This is a property that was built wholly by Emirates Airlines. It's an eco-tourism resort on the outskirts of Sydney. It's a carbon neutral, fully sustainable hotel resort called Wogan Valley. It's about an hour's drive from the airport in Sydney, and as you can see, it's quite attractive. So if you Google Wogan Valley, you'll find even more attractive images that I'm sure will put you on a plane very quickly to get there. This is not a Middle East investment into Australia, but it's an example of the type of food investment that's occurring in Australia, adding value to our natural resources. This Japanese company, Hakabakaku, was a successful manufacturer of rice noodles in Japan, but it identified a global opportunity to produce and supply high-quality noodles made from organic white wheat. So it's scoured the world to find the best organic white wheat and found that in Australia, and decided to establish a manufacturing facility in Australia, so adding value to our organic white wheat, and it's now exporting to Japan, US, Hong Kong and Singapore. In fact, 100% of the organic wheat noodles that go into Japan come from Australia. This is the National Broadband Network, is the biggest and most ambitious infrastructure project that any Australian government has ever undertaken. This is a $50 billion US project to connect 93% of households by fibre optic and the other 7% by satellite technology. And I'll give you the speeds in a minute. It's a massive project and construction has started. It'll actually take about 9 years to be fully completed, but a big percentage of the households will be connected within 2 or 3 years. So as you can see, 93% of the households will be connected by fibre with somewhere between 400 and 1,000 megabytes per second speed. Fibre optic is the freeway of the future. This kind of infrastructure will create enormous opportunities, not just from a business perspective, but also from a lifestyle perspective. Health and education, e-health and e-education, as a result of this network, will be dramatically escalated. And this is very, very interesting for regions such as this region, and even more so for places like Africa that have greater distances, to be able to connect with high speed over long distances. You know, Australia will be at the forefront of doing that. So why Australia? Why have we been so successful? We have a fairly competitive tax rate. We're not tax-free, but we're not overly taxed either. And there has been continuous tax reform over the last 20 years. So we're seeing a much more level playing field in our tax regime across corporate tax and personal tax. So we're sort of at the lower end of the scale. Again, reinforcing our engagement with Asia has really fueled our success, particularly in the last few years, and it continues to be the case, obviously, with 5 of our top 10 trading partners actually coming from Asia. Here's a look at our time zone. We sit between the European and the American time zone, which is particularly attractive for companies that operate 24/7. So if you have an international call centre or you have a software design centre, that product or that customer interface can happen with somebody in daytime 24/7. So, for example, I was previously based in Germany, and one of the projects I worked on was with an automotive design company that had an operation in the US and Europe, but didn't have an operation in this time zone. So now they established an operation in Australia, so they now design automotive components first in Europe. At the end of the day, they download it to Australia, they work on it for another 8 hours, they download it to America, they work on it for another hour, so you have 24 hours of product development. That's quite unique. And obviously that works for customer contact as well. If you're in Europe, and this has happened to me recently, if you're in Frankfurt and ring Lufthansa at 3 o'clock in the morning, you'll be speaking to a German speaker based in Melbourne. Because it's 10 o'clock? No, about midday in Australia then. These are some of the factors associated with lifestyle. I think you're probably fairly comfortable with the fact that the lifestyle that Australia offers is very attractive, but the facts support that on the World Competitors Yearbook, and we'll come to the most livable city or the second most livable city in a minute. Another key factor behind Australia's success is its multiculturalism and the diversity of the languages that are spoken and the connections that are created by a multicultural society. A large majority of Australian citizens were actually born overseas or are first generation Australians, so that provides enormous linkages around the world. And as you'll see, some of the languages that are spoken are China, European languages, etc. So as per the IMD World Competitors Yearbook, we are actually ranked first out of 57 countries in terms of general literacy. We're also ranked first out of 57 countries in terms of foreign tertiary level students per 1,000 inhabitants. So our tertiary education level, or our penetration level, is extremely high. That's a further reinforcement of the languages that we're able to speak. And we're still extremely cost competitive. We operate in a competitive world, and we understand that although we're an attractive place to live and work, we have to be cost competitive as well. So compared to cities in our region, such as Singapore and Hong Kong, we're extremely competitive, and we're in the same time zone. In terms of our internet connectivity, even before the national broadband network is rolled out, we're still very internet savvy and very e-focused. In fact, we ranked 6th in the world as per the Economist Intelligence Unit in terms of e-readiness. Obviously, the Scandinavian countries. Anyone here from Scandinavia? very impressive in terms of their performance. Hence, most of us have got Nokia phones or Ericsson phones. Australia is just behind the US. Probably the most important statistic up there is that we're the second most politically stable country in the world. So in terms of a risk profile, Australia is extremely low risk and has medium to high return potential. What about our banking structure? We have 4 major banks in Australia, so there's a high level of competitiveness amongst the 4 banks. But there's an enormous amount of rigour associated with that competition and how they're regulated, such that the 4 banks all have AA ratings globally. In fact, our 4 banks make up the top 9 banks globally in terms of their credit rating. So there's 2 banks there, they've got AAA, we're AA. So in terms of the top 9, we make up 4. So a very solid structural base, an open competitive environment. There's very little protectionism in Australia. There's been continuous reform for the last 20 or 30 years. Australia is made up of a federation of states. As I indicated before, we have Victoria, Melbourne here, starting at the bottom, Tasmania, is around about 400,000 people. Has a lot to offer in terms of particularly ecotourism and food and wine. And then we get to Victoria, and we'll have a presentation on Victoria. I'll give some more facts about Victoria in a minute. Melbourne itself is a population of around 4 million people. It's a large city. Flight time between Melbourne and Sydney is about 50 minutes. Sydney as well is about 4 million, probably 4.2. So this golden triangle here occupies a large chunk of the Australian population, which is 22 million in total. Further up the east coast is Brisbane. Greater Brisbane with Gold Coast and the Sunshine Coast is around about 2.5 million now. The further north you go, the warmer it gets, the sunnier it gets, and the warmer the water it gets. There's a particular connection between a lot of Emiratis and the Gold Coast in particular that enjoy spending the summer here, which is incredibly hot, which is then the winter in Australia. And in Queensland, it's probably about 28 degrees during winter. Moving over to Western Australia, which is an incredibly resource-rich state of Australia. Perth is the capital, around about 1.5 million people, probably about 2.2 million. And again, both these states, Victoria and Western Australia, I'll provide a bit more insights now. And we have our gentleman here ready to answer any questions. So as I mentioned, Melbourne is the capital of Victoria. I'm just going, this works. Yep, back here. It's actually my hometown. For those of you that follow the Formula One, you might know that Melbourne hosts. Actually, this year was the first. It was normally Bahrain hosts the first, but now Melbourne hosts the first Formula One, and we have one of the top drivers in the world, in Mark Webber, driving for Red Bull. It's a competitive and dynamic business environment, very multicultural in Australia, particularly European background, skilled and innovative workforce, fantastic infrastructure, supportive government, very pro-government, pro-business government, a great lifestyle. Now this is a really interesting fact. When you jump in your taxi after this event and go back to your hotel, 99% of the time you'll be jumping in a car that was manufactured in Australia. The Toyota Camry that is used by the Dubai RTA, all of those cars were manufactured in Australia. And there's a combination of reasons for that. Obviously it's a little bit hotter in Australia, so the conditions associated with building a car that can adapt to heat or tolerate heat was a big factor in why Australia could export cars. And the other is the ingenuity and the can-do attitude of Australia. It's even more remarkable given that the steering wheel in Australia is on the right-hand side rather than left-hand side. So we've had to create cars specifically for left-hand drive. Am I running out of time here? Lost?
You're fine.
No? Okay, this is not the Bermuda Triangle. If you jump in there, you won't get lost. You'll actually find an incredibly lucrative marketplace with, as I said, the total population is 22 million, but in this area here, including Sydney and Melbourne, you're going to cover 67% of the population. The airline route between Melbourne and Sydney is the third busiest in the world. Not many people know that. The reason is they're two very, very big cities, both with 4 million. And not many cities of that population that are connected that closely. The ease of doing business, that's demonstrated by the World Competitiveness Yearbook in terms of establishing a business. New Zealand as well is an incredibly open and simple economy to set up a business, so that they actually rank number 1, but we're number 2, so we're ahead of many OECD countries, even ahead of Singapore. Again, we're extremely competitive from a cost perspective, particularly if you look at Tokyo, obviously.
On that slide, if you can go back, you talked about the labor cost?
Yeah, sure.
Space costs. Relative to Asia and to OECD countries, where are you on labor?
In terms of labour costs?
In terms of labour costs.
Yeah, skilled labour. I don't know. Was that the next one? Previous one? It's not there. No.
Given 70%,
Sure, yeah,
you said, of your
I can give you
GDP is
insights.
coming from services, then labor would be clearly a significant input.
Medium-skilled and high-skilled labour, in comparison to Singapore and Hong Kong, for example, forget about Tokyo, we're cheaper from a skill set perspective. Obviously, low-skilled labour or unskilled labour, we're not competitive. So it's the high-skilled, high-value-added, we're incredibly, in our time zone, the most cost-competitive.
And how does it compare to OECD countries?
Well, it's pretty easy to compare with Europe, which is a lot more expensive. Really, we're competing in our time zone, and you'll find a number of multinational companies that might actually have their CEO in Singapore or Hong Kong, but they might have their CIO and CFO in Australia, or the Chief Marketing Officer in Australia. If they need to be close to their financial markets where they're receiving capital, sometimes they might have a head office in Singapore or Hong Kong, but the other skilled talent are sourced out of Australia.
You mentioned the competitiveness of your banking sector. You've got 4 very strong banks. all of them are AA. Can you talk a little bit about the role that those banks can play in FDI or foreign investors looking to invest in some of the sectors? How supportive are they of foreign investors investing in Australia?
All the Australian, the four banks that you mentioned, they're competing amongst themselves, but there's also a second-tier set of banks as well that are nipping away at their heels. So that keeps them fairly honest. All of those four banks have overseas offices and have overseas subsidiaries as well. So the Australian economy has been built on foreign direct investment. The economy.
And the local banks support via loans and bonds, etc., foreign investors looking to make investments, or should a foreign investor bring his own financing with him is really the question.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I mean, the Australian banks are quite experienced at supporting foreign direct investment into Australia. And Nick actually, who represents the Victorian government, comes from the finance industry and comes from one of the big four banks. So he's absolutely champing at the bit to come back to your question.
Thanks for the build-up. Hi everybody, my name is Nick Thornton. I'm from the Victorian Government. I'm the Regional Director for Investment Attraction. And yeah, as Bern indicated, I've got a banking background and enjoy talking about the subject. Look, as Robin indicated, the Australian banks are all AA rated, and were particularly strong for us during the financial crisis. They didn't have any exposure to the subprime debt issues in America, and also we've got a very supportive government towards the banking sector in Australia. And as the video presentation indicated, there's a very strong regulatory framework for banks in Australia as well. Not many people know the Dubai International Financial Centre actually signed its first memorandum of understanding with ASIC and APRA in Australia. The DFSA, which is the regulator, signed its first memorandum of understanding with the regulators in Australia. That's how we regard financial service regulation is considered in the world. The Australian banks have got a number of different strategies each. I won't go into those, but for example, ANZ that I can speak to has got a very aggressive international strategy, and many of you will know that they have a very impressive presence in Asia, and that they're extending that reach into the Middle East. And so, to Robert's question, I think that all the Australian banks are looking to actively engage other international banks and looking to actively take other bank risk. And certainly they're active in capital markets and wanting to partner with banks, obviously with consideration to sovereign risk and other political problems, but certainly they're very active. And we have, speaking of Victoria, have two of the Australian banks in Victoria, that's National Australia Bank and the ANZ Bank.
While we're on the banking sector, Arab Bank does have a number of branches in Australia, and at the moment the Australian government is reviewing its regulatory environment in relation to Islamic finance. Islamic finance is a little bit different in relation to the taxes that it incurs due to the capital transactions rather than interest transactions. Some of the states, in particular Victoria, have already altered their tax structure to ensure a level playing field for Islamic finance. So we're hoping within about 2 or 3 months to have a clear set of recommendations for regulatory change in Australia, which will put Islamic finance on a level playing field with other forms of finance. And there is a demand and a desire to see Islamic finance as an option in Australia. If GE, one of the biggest companies in the world, is doing sukuks, then there must be a reason for that. I don't think GE has any trouble securing finance around the world, but they chose to do a sukuk issue fairly recently, and for some of our larger corporates that is certainly of interest.
We have time for one question from the audience, if there are any.
got to
if you have a closing statement or...
We're going to go to West Australia.
Well, you got to wait in Malaysia. Sure, if you've got a few things you want to highlight about a little more about...
Well, certainly. I mean, Western Australia is a very resource-rich part of Australia. It's a massive part of Australia. A population of only 2.2 million, but which is 10% of the population, but over 25% of the GDP in resources and particularly agriculture as well. And in relation to this part of the world, agriculture is a natural connection and an area that we're seeing a lot of interest. That's where the food exports are going from WA all around the world. So there is, that's 1.4 billion in food exports going from WA into the region here, and that's a combination of meat and grain. But there's potential for more. This area here, you'll see, very good for grain, and this very good for pastoral and sheep grazing. Livestock. Not forgetting dairy as well, which is a major supplier into the region of dairy products, cheeses, milk powder. There are farms available to invest in Australia, and this is what you're likely to expect. Average size, about 4,000 hectares, and that kind of return. But longer term, agriculture is a very strong play. What you get with Australia is not just the raw material, you get the know-how and technology around the raw material as well, particularly in relation to adding value and supplying that product with a range of know-how that gets it from the farm to the table very effectively and efficiently, and most importantly, from a food safety perspective, at the highest international standards. There's ports all around Australia, so our infrastructure is very strong. It's growing. There's more investment going on in rail infrastructure around the world, around Australia, to connect our resources and our food products. And that was a quick wind up. So there's WA, Australia. Has everyone taken their little bag? You've been very, very patient, and I appreciate you coming along. Hat on, Ralph, that's great. He's a convert. Yeah, there's baseball caps, there's hats, and there's bags. Thank you very, very much. I'm happy to take any questions.
Welcome back. This is the country presentation for Malaysia. We have Farid Hamid, who is the General Manager of the Investment Management and Special Economic Zone, East Coast Economic Region Development Council, ECR. Welcome, Farid.
That's right. You've broken your promise. Since I'm talking just to Malaysians, can we just go out of the booth?
Indonesia dia pernah tak?
Yeah.
Ikut orang di sana dia orang tak pandai dia ikut. Dia sedia dia.
Okay. Shall we wait? Yes.
Just 2 minutes.
Firstly, I'd like to thank the United Arab Emirates Ministry of Foreign Trade, as well as OPTA, for giving us the opportunity to speak and to attend this conference today. This is on the third day. And we also we feel very honored as a result of the presence of the UAE Crown Prince and Prime Minister, who was gracious to open up a booth on the first day. And I think the picture was featured in the daily major paper today. Very grateful to that. This is a third presentation by Malaysia. The first one was on Monday, on Tuesday, the first day. And but since Bern is in the crowd, not to be outdone, but Malaysia also hosts the Formula One at Sabah. And with the full support of the Malaysian crowd, Mark Webber has done better in Sepang than in Melbourne. So, and
pressure.
and the second presentation was from our investment agency, Industrial Development Agency, yesterday, and Mr. Azman spoke about our macroeconomic statistics and data, and also the benefits of investing in Malaysia. Today, my presentation is in two parts. First, I will talk for about 15 minutes and go through some slides. And then the second part, again, the Aussies stole the thunder. I also will be showing a video. You beat me to it.